Stop consuming the thing that pretends to be light, but is really a slow cloud of distraction. Stop swallowing every soothing doctrine, every sensational headline, every curated spiritual selfie that promises meaning, and instead hands your attention away. If you want to keep what some ancient teachers called the third eye, the capacity to perceive beyond the surface, to recognize the trace of a source within you, then this is a warning and a guide. The phrase third eye here names an experiential faculty, an embodied sense of recollection, an inner sight that the texts found at Nag Hammadi and the Gospel of Philip describe in their own language. What I will offer is historical context, a map of the forces the tradition names, a careful, non-invasive way to check your body for signs the tradition points to, and practical steps you can take to protect and cultivate that perception. All extraordinary claims will be attributed to the Gnostic tradition and the Gospel of Philip. None will be promised as guaranteed facts. In 1945, a set of manuscripts was discovered near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. These 4th and 5th century texts, now generally referred to as the Nag Hammadi Library, contain writings attributed to a range of voices. Some Christian, some explicitly Gnostic, and some that blend myth, prayer, and philosophical reflection. Among these is the Gospel of Philip, a work that was never accepted into mainstream Christian canons and which survives only in fragments and translations. The Gospel of Philip contains passages that modern readers interpret as teaching about a kind of spiritual origin and the marks of that origin within certain people. Scholars debate the meanings and the dating. Historians caution that these were local texts, products of specific communities with their own vocabulary and rituals. I am not presenting those passages as canonical scripture or as settled historical proof. I am offering them as a tradition's testimony, a testimony that claims there are embodied signs and a method of recollection that can be felt directly by those who practice it. It matters why these texts were buried and why they remained hidden for so long. The Gospel of Philip and other writings from Nag Hammadi describe a way of bypassing intermediaries, a direct remembrance, an immediate return to a source sometimes called the monad, the singular, transcendent origin from which fragments of consciousness descended into material existence. That claim undermines the authority of any system that positions itself as the necessary mediator between the individual and the divine. Historically, communities who consolidated institutional power often treated such alternative teachings as dangerous or heretical. That history is complex and contested. The point for our present purpose is this: there were currents of teaching that emphasized personal verification over external validation, and those currents carried practices and descriptions intended to be tested in the body. What follows draws from that current, its language, its concerns, and the experiential techniques that are reported in these traditions. To understand why this matters for perception, it helps to sketch the cosmological framework that surfaces repeatedly in Gnostic texts. The monad is the ineffable, undivided source, the ground of being. Some traditions describe a descent from that source. Fragments of the monad become individuated, entering a realm of form and limitation. The demiurge, in many Gnostic accounts, is an architect or craftsman of the material realm, not always meant as the evil caricature of later polemics, but as the principle that organizes matter and enforces boundaries. Between the free, luminous origin and the dense field of matter stand intelligences the texts often call archons. Archons are described not as cartoon villains, but as forces, frequencies, or patterns that mask or distort the perception of the originating light. They operate by generating noise, competing narratives, attention-hungry distractions, fear-based loops, and the forms of authority that ask you to hand over your inner verification. This model is useful not because it replaces modern psychology or neuroscience, but because it names patterns you can observe. When your attention is habitually outsourced, when you rely on packaged belief instead of lived verification, your capacity for direct perception dulls. The tradition uses metaphor, veil, fog, prison, to point toward a phenomenology, a gradual bleaching of the sense that you are a remembered fragment of something prior to the world you inhabit. The remedy recommended by those texts is not intellectual assent, but embodied recollection. Practices that reorient attention to the living signals of the body, so the memory of origin can emerge through sensation and presence. At the heart of the Gospel of Philip and related descriptions is a surprising practical claim that certain people carry 3 marks in their bodies, signs one can check. The texts use symbolic language, but some interpreters take that language to refer to anatomical points. A mark at the base of the skull, a point linked to origin. A mark along the lateral side of the hand between the little finger's base and the wrist, linked to perception. And a point near the center of the chest, above the sternum, linked to command or interior authority. I will present these as claims from the Gnostic tradition, not as medical diagnoses, not as universally present, and not as guaranteed. Some people report subtle sensations when they explore these points. Others feel nothing. Both responses are normal. If you're willing, we will do a slow, careful, non-invasive check together. Before we begin, a short grounding. Find a quiet place where you can sit comfortably. You will not be asked to do anything risky or medical. If you have any concerns about physical or psychological well-being, please consult a professional. This practice is a guided, gentle invitation to attention. Begin by bringing your awareness to your breath. Breathe naturally, and notice the way the breath moves through your chest and belly. Allow your jaw and shoulders to soften slightly. You are not trying to produce a particular sensation. You are permitting attention to settle and notice. Now, very slowly, place the fingers of one hand at the base of your skull, the area where skull meets neck, roughly at the hollow beneath the occiput. Use light pressure, the pad of your fingers, not force. Rest your hand there and allow your attention to the contact. Notice any temperature change, any tingling, any subtle pressure that seems to reverberate inward. The tradition speaks of this point as signaling origin, a felt trace of the return to the source. You might feel nothing. You might feel a warmth, an electrical quickening, or simply a calming. Whatever you notice is acceptable. If an intrusive thought arises, this is nonsense. I should be doing something else. This feels silly. Simply notice the thought as thought and return your attention to the contact. The Gospel of Philip and related texts caution that resistance is expected. Labeling it doubt alone misses a more precise description. Often the first wave of distraction is the same mechanism that has kept the inner sight muted. After a few breaths, lift your hand and let your attention rest neutral for a moment. Gesture is not necessary. The point is that you have learned how to direct attention to the cranial juncture and notice what is there. Next, we will check the lateral line of the hand. Gentle, precise placement matters here. Rest the palm of the opposite hand so the base of your little finger faces you. Move your attention along the outside edge of that hand. The strip between the fleshy base of the little finger and the start of the wrist. Place a finger there lightly, as if you were tracing a seam. The tradition associates this line with perception, the faculty that receives images and impressions. Let your awareness track any subtle vibrations or shifts, a faint coolness, a pulse of sensitivity, an internal image, a memory, a shift in your sense of the immediate environment. Again, sensations will vary. Some people say the line feels alive, like an antenna. Some say it is quiet. Both are part of the field of possible responses. Observe how your mind reacts. If it begins to narrate or to compare this to something you once learned, note that tendency and come back to the tactile sense. The texts frequently warn that the archonic mechanism will attempt to recast direct sensation into familiar categories to neutralize its surprise. Your practice here is to name less and feel more. Finally, place the fingertips of one hand at the point above the center of your chest, the hollow where the sternum meets the chest, sometimes called the heart center, but in this tradition more specifically a command point. Rest your fingers lightly. The Gospel of Philip's account links this region to interior authority, not as dominance over others, but as alignment with an inner directive that remembers origin. Pay attention to quality rather than story. Do you notice a pressure, a warmth, a slight expansion? Do emotions surface without narrative? Some report a softening, a release. Others feel only neutrality. Many feel subtle shifts across all 3 points with repeated practice rather than immediate revelation on the first try. If at any point sensations become distressing, stop and seek professional help as needed. This is an investigative practice, not therapy. If sensations are neutral or absent, that too is normal. The tradition recognizes a range of responses and emphasizes patience over expectation. If, after exploring these points, you noticed something, however slight, you can mark your experience in the comments with the word recognition. If you prefer silence, keep that private. The suggestion to comment is a communal signal. It helps others know they are not alone in noticing or in not noticing. Do this only if you genuinely want to connect. It is an optional step. It is important to name what you may meet immediately after this kind of inquiry. Internal resistance that feels like derision, doubt, distraction, or even a sudden urge to prove the practice wrong. The Gospel of Philip and other Nag Hammadi texts describe a field of interference, archons, that intercept remembrance with narratives of dependency, with claims that only institutions can mediate the sacred. In modern terms, we can think of this as the mental noise that confuses identity with consumption. When you attempt to verify your inner perception, that noise will often generate arguments. You're imagining this. This isn't real. What you felt is meaningless. Those reactions are not proof that nothing was real. Often they are precisely the reaction that the tradition predicted. The recommended response is not to engage in a debate with the thought, but to observe it and return to sensation. Each time you notice and return, you are practicing an act of reclamation, the practice the ancients called anamnesis, recollection. Anecdote. One seeker I spoke with years ago described sitting in a crowded subway after trying a brief check. She reported a small warmth at the base of her skull, and, instead of the exhilaration she expected, a sudden wave of embarrassment and self-criticism that told her she had been foolish. She watched the thought, let it pass, and then simply began to notice the texture of the warmth again. Over weeks, she learned to treat the critical voice as a predictable pattern, a signal the practice was engaged, not a verdict. I share this as anecdotal, not as evidence of a universal pattern, but as a way to normalize the kind of mental punctuation many encounter. Once you have done the checks and practiced the gentle returning of attention, there is a short, non-magical activation people sometimes use, presented in various reconstructions of Gnostic practice as a concise declaration. In some modern circles, a 9-word sentence has been adopted as a training phrase. It is not ancient scripture in a canonical sense, but a contemporary tool shaped by traditional aims. If you choose to use it, speak it as a commitment to recollection rather than a pledge to supernatural results. The phrase that some practitioners use is, "I remember my origin. I return now to source." Say it aloud if that feels appropriate, or hold it silently as a mental posture. Let it resonate with the points you just checked. Notice whether speaking it shifts anything: posture, breath, emotional tone. Remember, some people feel nothing at first. Some feel subtle alignment. Both are acceptable. If speaking aloud is uncomfortable, use a mental version. Hold the words in mind as a quiet directive. The intention is to create a soft concordance between mind, breath, and the 3 points you examined. The tradition teaches that repetition cultivates receptivity without forcing an outcome. Variability is expected. Do not treat this as a promise that you will gain extraordinary powers. Treat it as a disciplined practice of attention. What you should stop consuming. In the sense the title warns, start by stopping the habitual ingestion of external validation that replaces inner verification. This includes patterns such as seeking belief from personalities, relying solely on mediated spiritual content to tell you what you feel, and accepting doctrines as substitutes for direct experience. It also includes the attention economy's constant demand for outrage and novelty, sensational spiritual media that promises quick ascension or definitive interpretations tends to erode the slow cultivation of inner sight. These categories are not conspiratorial accusations. They are pragmatic observations about how attention and reliance on external authorities can blunt your capacity for subtle perception. Another category to reduce is the consumption of fear-based narratives that keep you dependent on intermediaries. Institutions and messages that primarily operate through scarcity, guilt, or urgency can condition you to outsource discernment. Historically, Gnostic teachers argued that systems built around intermediated access to the sacred also discouraged personal verification. This is a contested historical claim, but it points to a practical truth. When your spiritual life becomes transactional, when you only receive truth through a ticket, a leader, or a repeated slogan, you are less likely to engage in embodied recollection. What to replace these consumptive habits with? The pattern offered by the tradition is simple and embodied. Cultivate daily micro-practices that return attention to your living sensations, your breath, and the quiet signals of your body. Make short checks at moments of transition. Before you open your phone in the morning, take 1 minute to place your hand at the base of your skull and breathe. Before a meeting, check the lateral hand line. When you feel overwhelmed, rest a palm lightly above the sternum and say your mental declaration. These are small acts of sovereignty, ways to re-anchor your attention in direct experience rather than outsourced meaning. Daily habits that support perceptual clarity include sleep hygiene, moderate exposure to sensational media, time in natural light, and periods of silence or reduced input. These recommendations are not magical. They are common-sense supports for a mind that can notice. If you are dealing with significant mental health concerns, please consult a professional. Spiritual practice is complementary to, not a replacement for, medical or psychological care. There are also practical rituals of community and accountability that align with the tradition's emphasis on fellowship among those who pursue recollection. The Gnostic communities described themselves as seekers in conversation, sharing insights while acknowledging the primacy of personal verification. If you choose to find companions, prefer small groups that value direct experience over doctrinal conformity. Use shared signals, like the suggested comment keyword recognition, to mark the presence of others who are practicing without turning that presence into a performance. Expect social consequences if you openly prioritize direct verification over received authority. Historically, seekers who claimed a direct line of recollection often found themselves marginalized by mainstream institutions. In the modern world, the cost may take subtler forms: friends who feel threatened, family members who interpret your changes as rejection, or colleagues who misunderstand your priorities. This is not to scare you, but to prepare you. Cultivate discernment about when to share and when to practice privately. Seek companions who can hold you without needing to convert you. Let's return to the question of resistance. What happens when your inner practice meets the momentum of the ordinary world? Archonic pushback, as described by the tradition, takes many forms. It can be a torrent of skepticism, a quick succession of tasks that distract you, sudden fatigue, or the appearance of an urgent external demand. The recommended approach is repetitive and mild. Notice, name, and return. Repetition builds a muscle memory of attention. Over time, the volume of the noise may diminish. Sometimes it changes shape instead, becoming more subtle. That change is often a good sign, not proof of failure. A short integration practice for daily life. At 3 points during your day, choose a quiet 1 to 2 minute check. Place a hand at the base of your skull, at the lateral hand line, or at the sternum point. Pause. Breathe. Name one sensation with curiosity rather than judgment. If nothing is present, note neutrality. If something arises, allow it. Micro-practices like this accumulate. They are not dramatic. Their value is their repetition. The traditions that grew from communities like those reflected in Nag Hammadi prized continuity over spectacle. Some viewers will push back. This sounds like a romantic reconstruction. Ancient texts are ambiguous. Modern adaptations are speculative. That critique is fair and necessary. The Gospel of Philip survives in fragmentary form, and scholars debate its meanings. I am not offering a definitive historical thesis. I am offering a possible lineage of practice worth exploring carefully. The responsibility for discernment falls to you. Use the tools provided here with humility and curiosity. Anecdote. Another person I worked with used the checks not as a religious test, but as a way to learn to slow down before major decisions. Over months, she reported a new capacity to notice whether an impulse came from anxiety or from a steadier interior source. She did not claim miraculous knowledge. She claimed improved clarity. I share this to indicate the modest, practical benefits some people report, not as a universal guarantee, but as a pattern worth trying for those who resonate. Before we close, a brief reminder of limits. The practices here are non-invasive and introspective. They are not a substitute for therapy, medical treatment, or professional guidance in matters of mental health. If you have a history of trauma, psychosis, or conditions where internal experiences become destabilizing, consult a qualified professional before attempting sustained inner work. The tradition itself acknowledged the need for guidance. What it offered as encouragement to the pneumatic seeker was not a license to leap without support. As a final practical sequence you can use today, find a quiet seat, do 3 cycles of slow breath to settle. Check the base of your skull with light contact and notice. Lift and neutralize. Trace the lateral hand line and notice. Place a hand at the sternum and speak or hold the mental declaration. I remember my origin. I return now to source. Do this sequence gently and without demand. If you feel something, note it. If you feel nothing, note that too. Optionally, after the practice, leave one word in the comments: recognition. That word is a small communal marker that others may use to know this message landed. To close the loop on the title, stop consuming the forms of spiritual and cultural content that ask you to trade your inner verification for a packaged identity. Stop consuming constant outrage and sensationalism that fray your attention. Stop consuming the narrative that you must outsource your seeing to intermediaries if you want to be spiritual. Replace those consumptive habits with small, embodied practices, repeated with patience. Find a modest community of seekers who prioritize personal experience over flashy claims. Honor the caution that these traditions ask of us. Verify, but do so with care. If you want to go deeper, I will be making a follow-up where we examine the specific categories of media and doctrine that most commonly erode perception, and where I'll offer a month-long practice plan to protect and strengthen the marks we discussed. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and consider sharing this with someone who is quietly searching for a way to reclaim their inner sight. Remember, these words are a map, not the territory. The Gospel of Philip and the Nag Hammadi texts provide one set of routes toward remembrance. Your task is to test gently, to observe without rush, and to care for your whole life as you practice. Whatever you consume, ideas, images, doctrines, or distractions, choose those that expand your capacity to notice, not those that steady your surrender of attention.